I remember as a kid when we landed on the moon, I was in our smoke-filled living room because my parents both chain smoked, which is acceptable at the time, watching the 25-inch color TV, which was also a very big deal at the time, in our apartment in Levittown, Pennsylvania, Brittany Springs Apartments. Don't live there anymore, by the way. And watching Neil Armstrong come down the ladder to the lunar surface from the lunar lander. That was an amazing experience for me as a kid. It shaped a lot of what I did the rest of my life. Now I've worked for NASA, for almost 30 years, which is crazy to think about, but there it is. And we now have a new moon lander. And this moon lander also has a way to egress to the surface of the moon. Similar to the original lunar lander, it requires you have to come down from the lander. This one is a significantly longer drop to the surface. When I say that, I mean significantly. The 3-foot drop from the last step on the ladder to the lunar surface was one of the things the engineers at NASA worried about at the time. Is that too far? Will they be able to get back up onto it to get back and ingress back into the lunar lander? And, that was one of the first things that they tested, is to make sure, I can get back on that ladder and we could get back into the lander. Very important thing. Getting out, important. Getting back in, more important. Now, that being said, there's some items I think you need to think about, make you aware of with the design of the new SpaceX Starship you may not have thought of. To give you some background, when we landed on the moon, we had the lunar car that we took to moon, which was incredible. The astronauts would get in it, drive off, come back. There was a restriction how far they could go, because should the car break down, they could only go far enough away that if it broke down, they had enough oxygen to walk back and get into the lander. So they were restricted with how far they could go, how long they could stay out there. They always had to take that into account. Now, that being said, I'm sure we're going to have vehicles on the moon. We're going to drive around. Same restriction will be there. If the vehicle breaks, you have to have enough oxygen to get back to the lander and into it so that you live, which seems like a good thing. So with the SpaceX lander, time is going to be needed to take the elevator back up into the rocket itself. Now, this human landing system is still in the design phase, but it's going to be somewhere between 160 and 180 feet tall. The door to get in it for the astronauts or lunarnauts or whatever we want to call them, let's just say it's 30 feet below the top of the rocket, just for argument's sake. So that means at a minimum, you're going to have to take an elevator 130 feet tall to get back into the rocket. So let's say the elevator elevates you at 1 foot per second, which I think is a reasonable rate. That's, fairly fast. So that means you're going to need 2.5 minutes or so to go from the lunar surface into the entrance to your habitat. That may not seem like a lot, but when you think about the fact that you take the same amount of time to get out and onto the lunar surface, 5 minutes of every excursion is going to use 5 minutes of oxygen. Now, how much oxygen will they have? They could have several hours with them, so it's not really that big a deal, I suppose. But let's explore the scenario where the elevator doesn't work and your home is 130 feet up. How are you going to get back in there? That scenario itself has several scenarios to think about. Let's say you get going and it breaks halfway up. What happens? Or if you're down on the surface and it doesn't move. So we need to address those scenarios. And when we're addressing those scenarios, the most important thing is making sure the astronauts have enough oxygen to live, to do whatever the workaround is to get back into the living habitat. So let's go over the scenario where the elevator is at the lunar surface and it's broken and it won't move. From what I've been reading, there is going to be a hand crank mechanism that you can use to get back into the rocket. So that being said, obviously that's going to be slower than using a winch that's electric, which we said, let's estimate 1 foot per second. Human turning a crank, going to be much slower. So let's say, for argument's sake, he'll be able to do a third as much. So let's say 0.3 feet per second. He has to elevate 130 feet at 0.3 feet per second. So doing the math, that means you've got about 8 minutes and 50 seconds. Let's just say 9 minutes. It's going to take you to get into the vehicle. That's not a trivial amount of time. That's something you have to plan for, and that is going to decrease the amount of time you can spend on the surface. So that's the happy scenario. You have to turn a crank to get yourself back in an elevator. What happens if the elevator doesn't move at all, and the mechanism itself with the hand crank isn't working because it uses a similar or related thing to whatever broke the elevator, so you can't hand crank? Right now, I don't see any of the designs that have a ladder on the side of the vehicle. I'm going to assume that they do by then, because you definitely are going to want that. You need to have some mechanism, either have a ladder on the side or have a rope with the type of device that mountain climbers use, where they can step up the rope like it's a ladder, and move the clips as they go up. You're going to need one of those two things. So let's just say it's one of those two, don't know which it's going to be, and you need to climb up 130 feet on the moon with your backpack in an astronaut suit. Now we have to think about the exertion it's going to take from the astronaut and the extra oxygen that they're going to use. Obviously, the harder you work climbing a ladder, climbing a rope, the more oxygen you're going to use. So doing the math again, let's take it down even more. Let's say they can climb that rope at about 0.2 feet per second. So now we have to account for that, and we have to add a figure for the extra air they're going to breathe because they're exerting themselves. So let's just double whatever the number is that we come up with. All right, so we take 160 divided by 0.2 gives us how many seconds? How many minutes is that? It's about almost 11 minutes. So you're going to need 11 minutes of effort to get back into the vehicle. Now, you're going to be using more oxygen in those 11 minutes. We said we would double it, so that means you're going to use 22 minutes worth of oxygen to get back into the vehicle. That means every single excursion from the human landing system will have to account for 22 minutes of oxygen just to get back into the vehicle. It will also have to account for the 5 minutes to get out of the vehicle. So just round a little bit, that's 30 minutes of every excursion. So that means you need to maintain a buffer of at least 30 minutes of oxygen for every single trip that you take out of the human landing system. Now, you need to also remember that we have to have a fudge factor on this, a safety buffer. Usually that's double. So that means 1 hour of oxygen needs to be reserved when you walk out the door for any lunar excursion. 1 hour. Now, losing an hour is not that bad. They're probably going to have 6 hours-ish anyway of oxygen on board, if not more. And it's not that hard to account for. I mean, it is a bit worrisome when you think about the fact that, we're going to have an astronaut climbing up a rope or a ladder as an emergency if the elevator breaks, but it is what it is. We just have to account for it. And you have 3 or 4 astronauts out there at the same time. Elevator breaks, 3 or 4 astronauts have to get on board. I'm assuming they're not going to do it in serial where one guy starts his way up, finishes, then the next guy starts. They're going to have to do it in parallel. So you're going to have, 3, 4 astronauts on this rope hanging there from the human landing system to get back inside, which seems a little dicey I guess it'd be all right if they succeed. If they don't, well, yeah. I thought this was an interesting topic to think about because it has to be taken into account. And it's one of the thousands of things you have to think about when you're designing a mission, a spacecraft. How are the astronauts going to get in, get out? How long does it take? What oxygen? There's so many variables. Space is not easy. It's constantly trying to kill you. You have to always remember that and plan for it. So when we do finally land with this, it'll be interesting to see what the final solution is going to be. Just thinking about it, doing a little mind experiment, I think the rope solution is probably going to be the way they go with the devices that they use to mountain climb and those kind of things on the rope. That seems like the best solution. You could have, people going up that all at the same time as long as the rope is strong enough, which it would be. And that could be it's a last resort, but it's functional. Anyway, hope you like this video. Please check in again. Have any thoughts, comments, questions, things you want to learn about, things you want me to talk about and make a video? Let me know. Have a nice day.